It was late September 1944 when Corporal Arthur Hayes and his unit of the 36th Infantry Division found themselves entrenched on the southern front of Italy, a craggy landscape of war-torn hills and muddy trenches. The Allied forces had been pushing steadily northward for weeks, and the battle for the Italian peninsula was far from over. Arthur was just 22 years old, young and full of ambition, despite the relentless chaos of war around him. He'd been drafted earlier that year, leaving behind his life in Boston and his fiancée Marie with promises of return. His letters home had painted a picture of hardship, but always one of hope. Yet on that fateful day, all hope would vanish. It was a morning like any other when Sergeant Mitchell briefed them for the reconnaissance mission. Arthur had been part of a small platoon tasked with scouting the dense forests around Monte Cassino, a region infamous for its brutal skirmishes and ambushes. They were given orders to find the position of German troops rumored to be hiding in the woods. The morning fog clung to the air, and the thick woods offered little visibility. They moved quietly through the trees, rifles held close, the sounds of distant artillery popping in the distance like thunder in a summer storm. The plan was simple: move swiftly, gather intel, and return before dark. But things didn't go as planned. At around 11 a.m., the platoon found themselves in a clearing, a seemingly peaceful break in the forest. The first shots rang out from the trees, sharp and sudden. The soldiers ducked behind trees, their hearts racing. Arthur could hear the German soldiers' boots crunching on the fallen leaves, moving closer. They fought back fiercely. The clearing turned into a chaotic battleground of gunfire and shouting. After what seemed like an eternity, the Germans retreated, but not before leaving a heavy toll on the platoon. There were casualties. 2 men were wounded, 1 fatally, but Arthur and the rest of the soldiers were alive. As the dust settled, the commander, Lieutenant Armstrong, counted the heads. Everyone was accounted for except for Corporal Hayes. "Hayes!" Lieutenant Armstrong called out, his voice strained with both fear and confusion. He scanned the clearing, but Arthur was nowhere to be seen. "Where the hell is Hayes?" The other soldiers, dazed and panting, looked around in panic. Hayes had been right next to Sergeant Mitchell when the firefight began. He had been within shouting distance, but now he was gone, completely vanished. The soldiers searched the area for hours, calling his name, looking through the bushes and even crawling into nearby ravines. But there was no sign of him. The ground had no footprints leading anywhere distinct, just chaos. It was as if the earth had swallowed him whole. The day wore on. By dusk, Lieutenant Armstrong gave the order to pull back to camp. He left a few men behind to continue searching, but the chances of finding Arthur seemed increasingly hopeless. The next day, a full investigation was launched. The military police combed the area and interviewed the surviving soldiers. There were conflicting stories. Some men claimed to have seen Arthur fall behind during the initial retreat, while others swore they hadn't seen him at all. His weapon was missing, his gear untouched. It was as though he had simply evaporated into thin air. The official report stated, Corporal Hayes was presumed lost in action during the firefight near Monte Cassino. There is no confirmed sighting of the individual after the initial engagement. The report signed by Lieutenant Armstrong was vague, unsatisfying. It offered no answers, no evidence, no closure, just a name added to the growing list of missing soldiers. But for Marie, Arthur's fiancée, the report was an unspeakable agony. She received the letter with trembling hands, the seal of the U.S. Army heavy with finality. Her world, once filled with dreams of their future together, now felt empty. The engagement ring that once glittered on her finger now seemed like a cruel reminder of a future that would never be. She wrote letters to every department, begged for any scrap of information. Was he alive? Was he a prisoner of war? Could anyone confirm what had happened? But the responses were always the same: presumed lost. Time went on. The war raged on across Europe, and soon it was over. The fighting in Italy came to a halt, and the remaining soldiers returned home, weary and scarred. For Marie, the years passed in an agonizing blur. She never gave up hope, never stopped believing that somehow Arthur might still be alive. But no one had answers. By 1945, the memorials were being built. Arthur's name was etched alongside so many others who had been lost in the conflict. The town of Boston mourned, but for Marie the loss was a private one, a silent grief that no one seemed to understand. The days turned into months and the months into years. Arthur's family held on to the hope that one day somehow they might receive some closure. But as the years went on, that hope began to wane. In 1952, Marie met with a former comrade of Arthur's, Private Ellis. He had been part of the same platoon during that fateful reconnaissance mission. "I saw him, Marie," Ellis said quietly. "I swear to you I saw him." Marie froze. "Saw him? What do you mean?" "I was back in Italy not long after the battle. I was on my way to a new posting when I saw Arthur. He was walking through the streets wearing civilian clothes. I tried to call out to him, but he didn't hear me. He just kept walking, disappearing into the crowd." Marie's heart raced. Could it be possible? Could Arthur have somehow survived? Private Ellis's words haunted her for the rest of her life. But without any further proof, no one else would believe him. They had no answers, no tangible evidence. And so the mystery of Corporal Arthur Hayes remained unsolved. The years that followed the end of the war were quiet and unsettling. The world was rebuilding, but for Marie, time seemed to stand still. Every day felt like an echo of that fateful day in 1944, when Arthur disappeared. In 1945, shortly after the war ended, Marie received a letter from the U.S. Army. The letter, sealed with the emblem of the military, had become all too familiar by now. She could hardly bring herself to open it, her fingers trembling as she tore the envelope. "Dear Miss Marie Hayes, we regret to inform you that after an exhaustive investigation, it has been concluded that your fiancé, Corporal Arthur Hayes, was lost in action during the reconnaissance mission near Monte Cassino, Italy. Due to the nature of the mission and the subsequent circumstances, his fate remains unclear. He is officially listed as missing in action and presumed dead. We extend our deepest condolences during this difficult time. Sincerely, U.S. Army Command." The words hit her like a physical blow. Missing in action. Presumed dead. The same words she had read countless times before, but this time they felt heavier. She sat down, the letter slipping from her hands as tears blurred her vision. In that moment, the hope she had clung to for so long seemed to evaporate, leaving her with nothing but an aching void. But the letter also held something else. A strange, almost imperceptible line that would forever alter the course of her grief. It read, "Private Ellis, a member of Corporal Hayes's platoon, has provided conflicting reports regarding the disappearance, suggesting possible alternative explanations." The implication was clear. Something was off. Marie read those lines over and over, and an idea began to form in her mind. A strange feeling of unease. Why would Private Ellis mention seeing Arthur after the battle if the Army had so thoroughly concluded he was dead? The inconsistency gnawed at her, and she decided she couldn't let it go. She would find the truth. In the years that followed, Marie wrote countless letters to military officials, requesting more information, asking for clarification about Ellis's statement. But each letter went unanswered. She clung to the belief that Arthur might still be out there somewhere. By the late 1940s, she had heard no news about Arthur, and slowly, the world moved on. Her life moved on, but not without its scars. Her grief became a silent companion, quiet but ever present. She never allowed herself to forget him, but the lack of answers wore her down. It was during the summer of 1952, when Marie was preparing to leave her parents' house and find a place of her own, that she met with Private Ellis again. Ellis had been one of the few survivors from that ill-fated reconnaissance mission. He had returned home haunted by the memories of war. Their conversation was brief, but it stayed with Marie forever. "I told you, Marie," Ellis said, his eyes downcast. "I saw him. After the battle. I tried to reach him, but he just vanished into the crowd. I couldn't get close enough to speak to him. I swear it was him, but I couldn't explain it." Marie's heart raced. A part of her wanted to believe him, to hold on to that hope. But how could she trust someone else's words when no one else had ever given her any concrete answers? "I need to know, Ellis, what do you think happened to him?" "What happened that day?" Ellis shifted uneasily in his chair. He looked away, his eyes filled with guilt and uncertainty. "I don't know, Marie. I can't make sense of it. It's as if he just disappeared, like he was caught in something bigger than the war." Marie's head spun. The words made no sense, but at the same time, they planted a seed of doubt in her mind. There had been no explanation for Arthur's disappearance. Nothing that made sense. In the late 1950s, Marie eventually married another man, though her love for Arthur never fully faded. But she could not forget the eerie feeling of those words from Private Ellis. The mystery of Arthur's disappearance lingered, unsettling her, no matter how much she tried to move forward. By 1961, Marie's health began to decline, and her once vibrant spirit became clouded by years of unanswered questions and unresolved grief. But still, she never stopped hoping for an answer, however faint it might seem. Her daughter, Helen, often heard her mother speak of Arthur as if he were still alive. Her voice tinged with both sadness and hope. It was then, in 1963, that a breakthrough came, though it wasn't the kind Marie had expected. A historian named George Evans, working on a project about the forgotten battles of the Italian campaign, stumbled across an old military journal. The journal had belonged to a high-ranking German officer, Lieutenant Hans Keller, who had been stationed near Monte Cassino in 1944. It had been stored in the archives of a military history center in London. The journal contained a single reference to an event that would make the hairs on the back of Marie's neck stand up. It was dated just days after Arthur's platoon had disappeared. On the morning of September 22, 1944, a group of American soldiers was captured by our forces during the engagement near Monte Cassino. We did not bring them to a prisoner of war camp. Instead, they were taken to a remote location, and their fates remain uncertain. One of the soldiers, a young corporal, seemed familiar. His name was Arthur Hayes. I have no explanation for why he was left behind, but I am certain he survived, though I saw him no more. The journal entry was brief, cryptic, and deeply unsettling. The soldier who had vanished, Arthur Hayes, was mentioned, and the words seemed to suggest that he had survived, only to disappear once more. Marie held the journal entry in her hands, her heart racing as she read the words over and over. This was the first solid clue she had ever received. Arthur had been taken, by the Germans perhaps, but what had happened afterward? Why had they never found him? And why had the U.S. Army never disclosed this detail? The uncertainty was overwhelming, but Marie now knew one thing. The mystery of Arthur Hayes was far from over. In 1974, nearly 30 years after Corporal Arthur Hayes vanished into the chaos of war, the world had moved on. The trauma of WWII had faded into history books, and the memories of the young soldier who disappeared in Italy had begun to dissolve with time. But for those closest to him, the pain was still fresh. For Marie, the years had turned the grief into a quiet, unspoken ache, one she lived with daily, like a wound that never quite healed. It was a crisp autumn afternoon when Marie received a letter that would change everything. The envelope was yellowed with age. The seal on it cracked and the handwriting was unfamiliar. The return address indicated that it came from an archive office in Italy, the same place that had once housed the German officer's journal that had shaken her to her core. With a trembling hand, she opened the letter, the paper soft with age and brittle at the edges. Dear Mrs. Hayes, I hope this letter finds you well. My name is Giuseppe Rossi, and I am a historian at the National Military Archive of Italy. During a routine investigation into military documents from the Italian front, I stumbled across an entry that might be of great interest to you. In 1944, a soldier named Corporal Arthur Hayes, part of the 36th Infantry Division, was captured by German forces near Monte Cassino. What follows in the documentation is a story unlike any other. I would like to invite you to Italy to discuss the findings. This may be the closure you have been searching for. Sincerely, Giuseppe Rossi, National Military Archive. Italy. Marie's heart skipped a beat as she read the letter again, this time more slowly, her mind racing. Could this be real? The name, the address, the mention of Arthur, it was as if the universe had decided to offer her an answer after all these years. It had been decades since anyone had shown any interest in solving the mystery of Arthur's disappearance. And now, someone had unearthed something substantial. Her mind immediately turned to the journal she had read years ago, where Lieutenant Keller had written that Arthur had been taken to a secret location. Could the Italian historian have found more details about that? Without hesitation, Marie made the decision. She would go to Italy, if only to finally uncover the truth that had haunted her for so long. It was in early December 1974 when Marie boarded a plane to Italy, her daughter Helen at her side, though the younger woman had little understanding of why this journey was so important. They arrived in Rome and made their way to the National Military Archive in a quiet corner of the city. The air was thick with history, with the weight of centuries of war and peace settling around them. Giuseppe Rossi was waiting for them in a small office lined with dusty bookshelves. He was a middle-aged man, his hair graying at the temples, but his eyes were sharp, filled with the intensity of someone who had spent years digging through old records, piecing together forgotten stories. "Mrs. Hayes, I am honored you could come," he said, standing and shaking her hand. His grip was firm, his voice soft but filled with urgency. "Please, have a seat." He motioned to the chairs across from him, and Marie sat down, her hands trembling slightly. "What have you found?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Rossi sat back, his expression somber. "I've been going through some documents that were sent to us by the U.S. government. They are incomplete, heavily redacted. But there's something that caught my eye." He slid a worn folder across the table. Inside were several pages of handwritten notes, some in English, others in German. The most significant document, however, was a map of an area near Monte Cassino, marked with locations and routes that seemed out of place. "I believe this is the route Corporal Hayes was taken on after he disappeared," Rossi said, pointing to the map. "It appears he was moved not to a prisoner of war camp but somewhere more isolated." Marie's heart raced as she studied the map. The location was deep in the mountains, miles from where the army thought he had been taken. "There's more," Rossi continued. "There's a document that mentions a secret operation, something that could explain why Hayes was taken to that remote location. It wasn't a normal POW situation. He was part of something more covert." Marie leaned in, her pulse quickening. "What kind of operation?" Rossi hesitated for a moment before pulling out another document, this one stamped with the official insignia of the German military. It was dated September 23, 1944, one day after the engagement in Monte Cassino. On the orders of higher command, a select group of American soldiers was relocated to a facility in the mountains. They were not to be processed as prisoners, but as part of a strategic intelligence operation. Their objective remains unclear, but there are reports suggesting that some of the soldiers were kept under observation for their knowledge of Allied operations. One of them, Corporal Hayes, may have been considered too valuable to release. Further orders on his status remain classified. Marie read the words slowly, her breath catching in her throat. Her thoughts raced. A secret mission? Was Arthur part of something bigger? This can't be real, Marie whispered, her mind struggling to process the implications. He wasn't just lost. He was taken for something the Army never told us. Rossi nodded gravely. "It appears so. The records are incomplete, but this is the first real evidence we've found that suggests Hayes' disappearance wasn't just a casualty of war. There are other documents here that might shed light on the nature of this operation, but they are still sealed. I've only been able to access parts of the records." Marie felt the weight of those words press on her chest. The hope that had been rekindled now had a more painful edge. Arthur had been part of something secret, something that had kept him hidden all these years. She had never wanted to believe it, but now the truth seemed undeniable. But what had happened to him? Why had no one ever told her this before? The answers she had spent decades searching for were now within her reach. Yet they raised even more troubling questions. The year was now 1975, and Marie, along with her daughter Helen and historian Giuseppe Rossi, had spent the past several months uncovering more about the mysterious disappearance of Corporal Arthur Hayes. The more they unearthed, the more the lines between truth and fiction blurred, as they pieced together the tangled web of secret operations and cover-ups. The journey had taken them deeper into the heart of Italy, through small towns and hidden archives, each discovery leading to more questions than answers. But it was a quiet, almost forgotten village high in the Italian mountains that would finally bring Marie the resolution she had been searching for. The facility, mentioned in the documents, the remote location where Arthur had been taken after his capture, was known only as Fortino Nobile, a secretive military outpost buried deep within the hills. It had been a former fortress used by both German and Allied forces during the war, but its existence was erased from most historical records. It was only through old, carefully hidden documents that Rossi had managed to track down its location. As they made their way to the mountain village, the air grew colder, and the landscape more desolate. Helen remained quiet, sensing the gravity of their mission, while Marie's heart beat with a mixture of excitement and dread. She didn't know what she expected to find, but she had come this far. She had to know. The village, with its narrow cobblestone streets and weathered stone buildings, looked almost abandoned. The only sign of life was an elderly man tending to a small garden outside his house. Rossi approached him speaking in Italian while Marie and Helen waited in silence. After a brief exchange, Rossi returned with a solemn expression. He says there's a road that leads up to the old fort, but no one goes up there anymore. The place has been empty for years. He told me that there are remnants of old bunkers, ruins, nothing more. But there's something strange he mentioned, Rossi said. He says that some people claim they've heard voices in the mountains, whispering of soldiers still trapped in the area. Marie's heart skipped a beat. Could it be? Could Arthur have been among those who were never released, whose fate had been sealed in secret, buried in history? Where is the road? She asked, trying to steady her voice. Rossi pointed toward the far end of the village. It's a narrow path, barely visible, but it leads up the mountain. We'll have to walk from here. The walk was difficult. The path grew steeper as they ascended, the air thinning as they climbed higher into the hills. The cold was biting, and the wind howled through the trees like the ghosts of soldiers long gone. Yet something urged Marie to keep going. Her thoughts were a storm of questions and fragmented memories. Had Arthur truly been part of something so dangerous? What had become of him? After what felt like hours, they arrived at the base of a craggy hill, where a series of old stone structures loomed in the distance. The ruins of Fortino Nobile were nothing like Marie had expected. The stone walls were crumbling, overrun by moss and vines. But there was an eerie stillness about the place, an unsettling sense that something had been left behind, untouched. As they ventured deeper into the ruins, they found remnants of old military equipment, rusted barrels, decaying crates, and shattered windows. But it was in the farthest corner of the fort, hidden beneath layers of collapsed stone, that they discovered the most shocking evidence. A small metal box, partially buried in the ground. Rossi carefully pried the box open, his hands trembling with anticipation. Inside they found a series of letters, each one carefully written and dated. The handwriting was familiar. Arthur's. Marie gasped. These are his. Rossi nodded solemnly. These letters were never meant to be found. The letters, though aged and fragile, were still legible. They told a story that was more horrifying than anything Marie could have imagined. Arthur had been taken to Fortino Nobile not as a prisoner of war, but as part of a covert mission. A mission to infiltrate a German intelligence network that had secretly aided the Allies during the war. He had been considered an asset, one too valuable to be left behind, and thus was forced to remain hidden for decades. The letters detailed the inner workings of the mission, including the true nature of his captivity. Arthur had been kept alive not by force, but because the Allies needed him to gather intelligence. The operation had been so secret that even his fellow soldiers never knew the full truth. But the most shocking revelation came in the final letter, dated in early 1945, just months before the war ended. I don't know how much longer I can keep this up. The secrecy is suffocating and the lies are growing too difficult to bear. They promised I would be released when the war ended, but the war is over, and here I remain, trapped in this forgotten place. They tell me I'm too valuable to release, but at what cost? I don't know who to trust anymore. The Germans who captured us, they're all dead now. But I'm still here, a prisoner in a war that has long since ended. Marie's hands shook as she read the final words. Arthur had known. He had known that he was never meant to be freed. The truth was crueler than she could have imagined. Arthur hadn't been lost in action. He had been abandoned, left to live in isolation, forgotten by both the enemy and his own country. Suddenly, everything fell into place. The missing soldiers, the mysterious operation, and the long silence. Arthur had been part of a dark secret, one that the Allies had buried. His name had never been meant to reach the public. His disappearance had been a carefully crafted cover-up to protect the operation's secrecy. Marie collapsed to her knees, the weight of the discovery too much to bear. For 30 years she had searched for closure, never knowing the depths of the betrayal her fiancé had endured. Rossi placed a hand gently on her shoulder. I'm sorry, Mrs. Hayes, but now you know the truth. Arthur was not forgotten. He was part of something much bigger. Marie nodded slowly, the tears falling freely now. She had finally found the truth, but it was a truth that was far darker than she had ever imagined. Arthur had been more than a missing soldier. He had been a pawn in a covert operation, left behind in the shadows of history. As she looked out over the ruined fort, Marie knew that while the mystery had been solved, the pain would never truly fade. Arthur had been lost to time, but now at least his story would be told.